Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So we just finished the 11th chapter of the Gita. I was reading there's a guy named Robert Minor, who was an academic. He did a commentary on the Gita in English. He didn't bother translating the text. It was just a commentary. So he gave the verses in Sanskrit, and then he wrote a commentary. It was a commentary for scholars. And, there's a bunch of people who commented on the Gita whose commentaries I didn't read. I generally tend to read Sanskrit commentaries from our lineage or Prabhupada's commentary, but reading Western academics' commentaries wasn't something that I've done a whole lot of. But I think primarily because I find that they just have a real hard time understanding the text. They just, I've always been underwhelmed by the caliber of the commentaries put out by Western academics. And that's not to be, biased against them, just really objectively looking at what they contribute to, like compared to like a Ramanuja or something like that. They really display a lack of reading comprehension. Let's close that door. It's too much noise for me. And so anyway, I've always preferred the commentaries of our tradition, not because I'm biased and dead set against reading commentaries from outside of our lineage, but more just because I'm looking to learn the subject matter and understand it comprehensively. And I found that Western academics, specifically when it comes to figuring out and deriving meaning from Vedic texts, they just do a poor job. So anyway, I was reading this commentary by Minor, who I appreciated because you get to take a look at 200 years of Western scholarship on the Gita. It's in one place, and he does a good job of collating and comparing the various commentaries. And he brings in traditional commentators as well. He brings in Bhaskar and all sorts of like really old commentaries in Sanskrit. So anyway, he quoted one Western academic whose name escapes me at the moment, but his comment was, the 12th chapter of the Gita is the biggest letdown in the entire history of world literature, which I appreciated because, not because I agree with it, but I appreciated it because it just showed the way he was reading the text. There's in the 10th chapter, Arjuna wants to live in a divinely inspired world where the world acts as a stimulus for him to think of divinity. And so Krishna defines himself as the superlative exemplar in 70 distinct categories and invokes something extremely reminiscent of the Scala Naturae that's there from the time of Aristotle and was all through the Middle Ages, where you see the world in a divine order. And there's a hierarchy, a sacred order to the world. And then in the 11th chapter, Arjuna says, I want to see this now. In other words, Krishna has theoretically explained his connection to the world so that the world can become a stimulus for divine connection instead of an antagonist to remembering God. And then Arjuna says, now I want to see it. That's quite an elegant, natural evolution. You theoretically understand something and then you want to experience it practically. It's a natural evolution. And so, Yeah, it's a nice flow of the text. So the 10th chapter, Krishna's gone on, practically speaking, uninterruptedly, which is a small little interruption in the beginning of the 8th chapter where Arjuna asks about terms Krishna himself has introduced. So Krishna introduces Adhyatma and Adidaiva and Adibhota and Karma and Brahman and Adi Yagya. 6 terms Krishna introduced at the end of the 7th chapter, and Arjuna says, what do these 6 terms mean? But other than that, since the beginning of the 5th chapter, I guess there's a little bit in the 6th chapter as well where Krishna says he can't control his mind. But other than those 2 instances, Krishna's been on a monologue since the 5th chapter. There's nothing from Arjuna in the 9th chapter, only at the beginning of the 8th chapter, nothing in the 7th chapter, a little, I can't do this in the 6th chapter, and then his questions at the beginning of the 5th chapter. So Krishna went on, finished his monologue with the Chatushloki. Arjuna responded, asked for him to be able to understand, for Krishna to explain to him how he's manifested in the world so Arjuna can look at the world through a different lens. And whereas Krishna had foreshadowed that in the 7th and 9th chapter, he did a full-blown version of it in the 10th chapter. And then Arjuna wanted to experience it. And that was the Vishvarup Darshan, which turned into the Kala Rup Darshan, so that Arjuna was able to see all the good and all the bad as being, quote-unquote bad, as being connected to divinity. And Arjuna is, he's exalted at certain points in the 11th chapter, and then he's also bewildered and filled with fear. And there's some, even though it's a pretty big power move, Prabhupada, says, in one of the purports, he says that devotees are not interested in this godless display of opulence. Because especially if you seem bewildered, you're not focused. Devotees aren't interested in the godless display of opulence because there's so much power that Krishna was manifesting that it's not something that someone who's interested in an intimate relationship with divinity would be excited by. And so there's, but then there's a little bit of that sweetness there at the end with the Manusham Rupam, with a human-like form, and the Saumya Vapu, the cooling form, the beautiful form. And so you even get a little bit of a nod to a more intimate conception of divinity. Of course, Krishna finishes off with a flourish. There's several beautiful verses. Bhaktya mama bijanati yavanyas chasmi tattva. You can only understand me by bhakti. And then mat karma krid mat parama mat bhakta sangha varjita. You should dedicate all your works to me, become my devotee, give up bad association, and hold me as the highest objects. And then yasa mameti pandava. And then that person who does that will come to me. There's it's just a nice, he finishes off really strongly with some heavy verses on bhakti. And then the conversation just resumes with Arjuna asking some questions in the 12th chapter. And it's such a letdown. If you're to view the Gita as a dramatic performance, if you're viewing the Gita as a dramatic performance, if you're viewing the Gita as like a movie or even like a hero's journey type thing, then Arjuna's come out of the abyss and what's next? There's almost nothing left. You save the girl and you save the world and you win $1 billion and kill all the bad guys, and it's like, what's left? What's left in that? You ride off into the sunset. That's the end of the movie. But then the Gita still has 7 additional chapters. And so for this academic, when he read the 12th chapter, he called it the biggest letdown in the history of world literature, because he was thinking that this Vishwarup Darshan, this vision of the universal form, Arjuna seeing the universe as God, he thought that was like, wow, That was amazing. Couldn't get any better than that. And this simultaneously is interesting. It's an interesting factoid, and it, in some ways, it's quite an insightful reaction to the Gita. It shares with you how a large percent of the population, if they were intelligent enough, would react to the Gita. And it also simultaneously, in a very elegant way, explains why I'm so underwhelmed with Western academia's treatment of the Gita over the last, whatever. They've been translating the Gita the Chinese were translating it thousands of years ago. Islam got into it 1,000 years back. Western scholarship's been doing it since before, right around the time the U.S. declared its independence. And so it's been, maybe 1787, I think, was the first date of the Gita. Although that might be the day that might be when the Muslims were repelled from Vienna, and it was the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire. It's also right around the time of the French Revolution, so I get confused about those dates. They're all right there. There's a little pocket in there. But around that same time, the Gita was first rendered into English. And so this reaction, for me, it just really highlights how foolish and ignorant and underwhelming Western scholarship has been in terms of understanding the Gita. Because the 12th chapter flows really nicely and really smoothly from the 11th chapter. It's a perfect next act. It's a perfect sequel. It's filled with all sorts of amazing stuff. It's intriguing. You'd even say it's sexy from a philosophical point of view. And it's just for somebody who thought the Gita was like Star Wars or something like that, they might be disappointed. But for someone who understands the Gita for what it is, the 12th chapter is a brilliant follow-up on what we've done already. So I recapped the 10th and 11th chapter and a little bit more, so that as I read the 12th chapter to you guys, you would have a chance to try to see if you could sniff out and notice and figure out what the connection between the 11th and 12th chapter is. So in addition to being an intro, it was also me giving you guys some prep so that I can now read the 12th chapter sans introduction and have you guys try to figure it out for yourselves what's going on. Okay? All right. And we don't have to read a lot. Arjuna inquired, which are considered to be the most perfect? Those who are always properly engaged in your devotional service, or those who worship the impersonal Brahman, the unmanifested? Let's read that again. Arjuna inquired, which are considered to be the most perfect? So you get it? A question is being asked. And it's a dichotomized question. There's two possibilities, and Arjuna is asking for which of two people are most perfect. And so who are they? Possibility A, those who are always properly engaged in your devotional service, and possibility B, or those who worship the impersonal Brahman, the unmanifested. So with a little bit of, junior high school level English, you should be able to understand the question. Did you understand the question, Liv? You understand the question? Although you guys were born here, your first language was Spanish, right? You? Yeah. I always treat you guys like your ESL. You know, there's something about being a native speaker and having it be your birth language that makes it easier to just read something and comprehend it. Otherwise, you have to move much more slowly and methodically to really read with comprehension. Okay, so let's look at the Sanskrit. Evam satata yukta ye. Tesham ke yoga vittamaha. Of them who are yoga vittama. Yoga vittama. Yoga vittama. Vit is actually where you get the word wit in English. Vit is also where you get the word Veda from. Vittama, the greatest knowers of yoga. Ke yoga vittama. Who's the greatest knower of yoga? Tesham, amongst them. You follow? Amongst those who are satata yukta, who are always yoked to you. Yukta is also from the same word yoga. It's cognate to yoga. It's not cognate to, it's another, it's a verbal past participle of huge. It means yogad. So the people who are yoga vittama, tama means greatest, they're the greatest knowers of yoga. Everybody's yogad to you. You get the point? So it's not a question of who's yogad to you and who's not. Everybody's connected to you. The question now isn't who's connected to you, it's who knows the highest truth, who's the greatest knower of yoga, and you could interpret this a little bit more as to be who's the most connected to you, who's the highest yogi, who's in possession of the greatest knowledge of yoga, who has the fullest understanding of yoga, might be the best rendering into English. You follow? And then there's two possibilities. Bhaktastvam paryupasate. Your devotees who are worshiping you. Or cha api aksharam avyaktam. Or those who are worshiping you as akshar, and as avyakta, So, akshar means without decay, and so akshara means something which is beyond this world, which is not subject to the laws of this world. And avyakta, vyakta means manifested, and so avyakta means unmanifested. So something which is transcendental to this world, which is invisible. So avyakta means unmanifested, invisible, and akshara means indefatigable, undecaying. You follow? Sanskrit phonemes are called akshar. Letters are symbolic representations of phonemes. Phonemes are the articulable parts of speech. Letters symbolize them. Did you follow that? That was a little beginner's course in semiotics. So, letters symbolize phonemes. The phonemes are different than the letters because the letter is merely a symbol for a phoneme, where a phoneme is actually the smallest articulable units of human speech. The smallest articulable units of human speech in Sanskrit are called akshar because they are quantum. They are the smallest things. Ko, ko, go, go, no, like that. The smallest articulable elements of speech. Do you follow this? There's a letter K, but the sound is K. You follow? All right. So, Tesham Ke Yoga Vittamaha. Of them, who is the greatest knower of yoga? Who has the fullest understanding of yoga? Who's the highest yogi? Out of those who are Satata Yukta, who are, everybody is always connected to you. They're all spiritualists. And they're all Paryupasate. They're all worshiping you. But you've got those who are worshiping you as Akshara and Avyakta, as unmanifested and inexhaustible. And then you've got Bhaktastvam, your devotees. I'm going to give you a little bit more information. The term Akshar is used in the Gita to refer to the Vedas, Krishna, Brahman, so many things. But the word Akshar and Avyakta, these are what would be called apophatic language. Apophatic theology, also known as via negativa theology, known in Sanskrit as neti neti, which means not this, is a way of describing God where you describe God by saying what God is not. Thomas Aquinas, the father of Catholic theology, the most important figure in Catholicism, turn of the millennium philosopher. He said you cannot say what God is, you can only say what God is not. The first instance of apophatic theology in the world of literature is the Upanishads of ancient India. And so this describing God by saying what God is not has an extremely long history in Indian philosophy. And it will be evidenced by Krishna's response to this question, that what Arjuna is asking about, and it's even from this, if you understand Indian philosophy and you have a glossary of terms in the Sanskrit language, you'll be able to understand what Arjuna's question is really asking. But if you don't know a glossary of Sanskrit terms and you don't have a background in Indian philosophy, you might have to read Krishna's answer to be able to discern what Arjuna was asking. Krishna's answer helps you to understand Arjuna's question. Did you follow that? You know? Like if somebody says, what do you want to drink? And you say, oh, thanks for asking. I know you give me a choice between lemonade and water, and I'll take water today. Now the very generic question, what would you like to drink? Which is an extremely open-ended question. Could mean that I drink alcohol, or it could mean anything, actually. You could even give a philosophical idea about drinking. You know, Trishna is described by the Buddha. Trishna means thirst in Sanskrit. The word Trishna is described by Buddha as being the cause of all problems. The word Trishna or thirst is synonymous with calm or desire. And so Buddhism uses the word Trishna or thirst in the same way that we use the term desire or lust or calm. So somebody says, what are you drinking? You could interpret that in a bit of an esoteric way, and you could say that, oh, he's asking, what are your material desires? Or you could take it in an extremely general way, and you could think they're offering you anything. But if my answer to somebody asking me, what do you want to drink? And I say to the person, oh, well, you always offer me either lemonade or water, and so today I'll choose water or lemonade. Then when somebody goes, what did he mean when he asked, what does he want to drink? You'll go, oh, he offers him these two drinks. So he was asking him which one of those two he wanted. And the person's response actually helps you to understand the question. Of course, if the person responding to the question is God, who's omniscient, and the person who asked the question rolls with the answer and doesn't say, you misunderstood me, let me clarify my question, then you got even more reasons to take Krishna's answer as being extremely useful in determining what Arjuna's enigmatic question may actually be intending. Did you guys follow that? Without even going into the specifics of Krishna's answer, a person with a reasonable degree of background in Indian philosophy and a reasonable glossary of terms, which I practically speaking just gave you, should be able to discern the extremely loaded question Arjuna was asking and understand the relationship between the two chapters. Does anybody think they can do that right now without me bothering to explain the question in more detail, which makes it even easier to answer and point out the connection between the two chapters? Really? Yeah. Tadeo, you want to go first? I got more faith in you than Ross.
Hope I won't disappoint you, Prabhu.
You never disappoint me. Go for it.
So, chapter 10, Krishna tells Arjuna how he can see him in the material world.
No, you don't know it. Your answer's wrong. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm not omniscient. But I'm just going to go ahead and cut you off and say your answer's wrong. If you tell me you were right all along, I'll humbly apologize and acknowledge your greatness and my foolishness. But I'm just going to go with that I sussed you out and you missed it. And I'll tell you why. Okay, Ross, you sure?
Fairly sure.
You got like a short leash. Yell at me. Yell at me.
In chapter 11, Krishna showed Arjuna both an impersonal form and a personal form. And so therefore, Arjuna is asking now, which is the preferred method of getting close to you or connecting with you.
Perfect. Impersonalism, and I'll get back to you in a second today. Impersonalism and personalism are extremely common, ubiquitous, all-pervasive, ever-present features of Indian spirituality. If you have a degree in philosophy from a university, if you have a master's degree in philosophy from a university, if you have a PhD in philosophy from a university, you may still not even know these terms personal and impersonal. Western philosophy does not have a language to describe personalism and impersonalism. Those terms, personalism and impersonalism, are really from Prabhupada. He used those terms. Those terms are not, if you look up like impersonalism in Wiki, you won't find an entry in Wiki under impersonalism. That was Prabhupada's, I don't want to say it's a neologism from Prabhupada, because obviously the word impersonal and what have you already existed. But Prabhupada used the term in a very specific way to refer to Dvaita and Advaita in Sanskrit. And he used the terms to refer to what are universal features of Indian spirituality for thousands of years. it's like nails on a chalkboard sometimes when I listen to Western academics and even spiritualists talk about God. Because it'll be very common to hear a Christian theologian speak about his love for Christ and the suffering of Christ on the cross and the passion and the mercy of Christ. I mean, they make a bunch of other errors like an eternal hell and that God needed somehow to bleed somebody in order to forgive you. But then they'll say something after this whole big, long treatment of this beautiful self-sacrifice that was made by Jesus. They'll just throw something in there like a red herring, and they'll say, and then you enter into the cave of Christ and become one and merge into the light. They'll say stuff like that, which is like philosophically nauseating to me. Not just because I'm nauseated by impersonalism, which I am, but because it demonstrates an absolute lack of understanding of the basic incompatibility of personalism and impersonalism, and how you got to pick one. It would be, I just thought of an equivalent. Imagine if you met somebody and they liked to go to Ku Klux Klan meetings on Sunday, and then they like to go to BLM meetings on Monday. And they had like a KKK tattoo on one arm and a BLM tattoo on the other arm. And when you talk to them, they would vacillate between just horrible, racist, rants, and then really cutting edge, contemporary liberal philosophy. And they would just bounce and ping pong back and forth between the two without acknowledging the poor syncretism and the basic incompatibility and almost their philosophical borderline personality disorder of radically opposing thoughts occupying the same mental space at the same time. So, the way to understand personalism and impersonalism that I usually invoke is I ask somebody a question. When you achieve perfection, absolute perfection, complete and total perfection, Purnatama, the greatest perfection, and you ascend to the zenith of spirituality, do you, A, become one with the universe, where all difference between you and everybody else evaporates, and you realize an absolute and complete and total oneness with everything? And you realize that any distinction you ever saw between any two things in reality was an illusion. And you transcend that illusion and literally become one with everything in every way. That's called Kevala Dvaita, by the way. The word Kevala, pure, is extremely important in understanding Advaita philosophy. Without that word, Kevala, pure, you may not have a pure monism. Amazingly, monism can be used for an atheistic philosophy as well as a theistic philosophy. So even the term monism, that some people think is a great philosophical term, is not. You can do a pure monism, but your pure monism can also be that everything is made up of atoms and nothing else. And you can have a pure monistic philosophy that's an absolute physicalist position. But anyway, that is the answer. It's not an answer that you can give in a single word, because impersonalism and monism do not convey the absolute nature of it. Pure monism does, and it would have to be pure spiritual monism. We could put together a few words, but then I have to explain what I meant when I said pure, what I meant when I said spiritual, and what I meant when I said monism, and then I'm back to using paragraphs to explain what I'm intending to communicate to somebody. Do you follow this? That's option A. Option B is that when you achieve that zenith, apex, etc., you go back to heaven And although you may be one in spirit with God, you may be like a spark returned to a flame and like a photon returned to the sun. And although you may be of the same spiritual nature of divinity, and although you may realize your oneness and connection with everything that exists, you still exist as an individual expression of spirit. And you have the capability of a loving relationship with divinity and potentially with other spirits as well, although that's actually a side point. They usually go hand in hand, but it doesn't have to. You could be the only soul in existence and it's just you and God. You live in a vacuum with the deity and there's nobody else, like a Nitya Nikunja Bihari or something like that. But yeah, you retain enough of your individuality. Your individuality is a permanent feature of your soul, and it exists in perpetuity. And you are always distinct enough from God that there's a potential of a relationship of love, which is a binder that takes two things which are different and binds them together. There's no daughter and mother. There's no love between them. Love depends on a backdrop of difference in order for it to unite. And so though you may be united and yoga to, and linked to, and connected to, and one with, it's not a pure absolute oneness, because there's still enough room for love to exist, and expressions of love, and devotion, and service, and intimacy, and romance, and everything else with the deity. Did you guys follow that? I doubt you did, but that's okay. It's all right. You usually got to hear it about 15 or 20 times over the course of a year to really get it. But I listened to myself talk because I'm smart like that, and what I said made sense, and I explained it. I could go over it 5 or 6 more times and give you guys a better and better understanding of it, but I've explained it. The word akshara and avyakta communicate that he's talking about impersonalism. Krishna's answer also indicates that he was talking about impersonalism. But we have here in this section, up till this point in the Gita, there is a place in the 15th chapter where it's made even more explicit, the superiority of personalism over impersonalism. But up till this point in the Gita, we now have the clearest discussion of what's better, personalism or impersonalism. There have been any number of verses which convey that personalism is better, that they have an implied premise of personalism, and they represent Krishna's primary teaching. But right now, personalism and impersonalism are being brought to a header by Arjuna so that Krishna can definitively weigh in on the subject. I saw you. And so it's an incredibly important discussion. The other thing is this. This is not just an Indian thing. Like there's Indian spirituality, and sometimes you get these extremely nuanced debates which seem to not have that much. Like in a court of law you have material facts. Material facts are things which are important. Then you have immaterial facts. Immaterial facts are details that don't really change the tenor of what's being discussed, and you could go either way with them. They don't necessitate a complete shifting of your opinion or your judgment. But the material facts of the case are the facts that must be considered by whoever the arbiter is of the case. They represent the core of what's being discussed or debated. You follow? So we now have the critical discussion that every single spiritualist must have. And it's not specific to Indian spirituality. There are sometimes debates that are heavily specific to Indian spirituality that, you're almost like, unless you're in that world, it's like, what's really the big deal? But some acharya somewhere sometime said this, and therefore it's a huge debate between people. But then sometimes you find a debate in a given culture that may be foreign to your own, And that debate represents the essence of spirituality. The essential question that has to be answered. One of the big questions. Like there's the big four outlaw motorcycle gangs. And there's like the big four, the Hells Angels and the Mongols and the outlaws and the banditos. They're the four big ones, the biggest, largest outlaw organized criminal enterprises as outlaw motorcycle gangs. You follow? Or sometimes so you have these, the big ones. You have your cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C personality disorders. And so amongst those, your cluster Bs are, extremely important to look at. There's 4 of those, right? Antisocial, histrionic, borderline, and narcissism. Yeah, there you go. Your 4 cluster Bs. You got cluster A's. Those, actually, they're just as bad. They're your schizoid disorders. Those are pretty bad. People get psychotic on those and do all sorts of bad stuff. Then you get your cluster C's, which get into like anxiety, right? Oh yeah. And so you get your, so there's, if there was a list of the essential qualities, questions that every spiritualist on the planet has to ask and answer for themselves to have a grade school level or a college level understanding of spirituality, personalism versus impersonalism is on every list. It's the basics. It really is the question of who am I? Who am I fundamentally, eternally? Also, who is God fundamentally, eternally? And what is my relationship with God fundamentally, eternally? This question, because what happens at the zenith, it deals with that. What is God's fundamental identity as an individual? Can I love God forever? Or does love evaporate upon the achievement of liberation? Compassion, which also depends on you being different than the person you feel compassion for. If compassion also is a material quality that ultimately has to evaporate, or is compassion a divine quality, which is cultivated in perpetuity? Does the arhat, that's the old word for the bodhisattva, the word that was used during the time of the Buddha, does the arhat cease to exist? Or does the arhat continue to exist to help others? What happens at the zenith? Is that nirvana a complete extinguishing of your existence? Or is it an extinguishing of your material existence that allows for some spiritual existence to continue? Who am I? And what's my eternal relationship with divinity? And what's the nature of divinity? There is no more basic question, and the basic answer to that basic question, the first, that question may have a number of different questions that it implies. So who am I? What is God? And what's our relationship? Those are big questions that might have 100 sub-questions underneath them, but the first sub-question is, how permanent is my individual existence? How permanent is God's individuality? And how permanent is the love, devotion between us? It's the most important question, and it's the first part of that most important question. So it's got to be dealt with in the Gita anyway. And it could just be a shift and a pivot to a new question, because they finished that, now they can talk about something new. And Krishna did just go so big on bhakti in these last verses, and so big on his form. His Saumya Vapu. He talked about his Saumya Vapu, his beautiful form, his Manusham Rupam, his human-like form. That this form is so special, you can only achieve it by bhakti. That you'll come to me through bhakti. And now Arjuna's thinking, well, I've heard about this whole impersonal thing. And so, how does that whole bhakti thing that you're arguing for fit together with my pre-existing knowledge of impersonalism? So, option 1, we got to deal with this because it's question 1, and it's the first part of question 1, and therefore it's great that it's being brought up. Part 2 is, Well, we got done with this ecstatic display of divinity, so now we have to understand what we just saw. That's kind of another angle. Option 3 is you just went big on bhakti and an eternal form, and now I want to understand how that overlaps with or interfaces with previous ideas I've heard from the Upanishads and various gurus and what have you about impersonalism. Did you follow this? Those are 3, none of which are what you said. And then number 4 is you displayed to me a form where I saw everything. So I would have seen personal and impersonal features. And if we look through the 11th chapter, we will find impersonal things where Arjuna says, you are everything. Sarvam Tvam, you are everything. He literally says that. So there were impersonal features of that universal form. Logically, A, there had to be, and B, they're actually stated in the Sanskrit. And then there were these intensely personal features, and I recognize there's a basic dichotomy and incompatibility and a natural mutual exclusion between those two ideas. And before you think, well, no, I'm a personalist and impersonalist. Yeah, that's called, that's our philosophy. And Ramanujas, and the Nimbarkacharyas, and Vishnu Swamis. Everybody does that. You're one with God in quality, you're different in quantity. You're a spark to a flame, you're a ray of light to the sunshine. But they always still hold that within that divinity, like really, you could say the universe is Krishna. But within that universe that all is Krishna, there's parts, and those parts are eternal parts. And therefore everything is one, but within that oneness, there's parts. Did you follow that? There's differences between 2 different items, like a mridanga and a chair. Then there's differences between 2 mridangas in the same category. So they're both mridangas, but are there different? So there's 2 mridangas on there. And then there's finally the difference between the mridanga, its straps, and it's I guess a big strap that you use for carrying, and the clay of the drum, and the head of the drum, etc., etc. So the difference within something, within itself. And so everything can be seen as part of Krishna. But Krishna can still be a variegated divinity. And therefore there's room for multiple parts of Krishna, which still gets you to a dualistic philosophy, because within the overarching feature of divinity that everything is Krishna, there's still room for Krishna as an individual soul that can have eternal devotion towards Krishna as the Supreme Lord. And for all intents and purposes, there's a distinction between you and God, even though you're both under the aegis or umbrella of God. Do you guys follow this? So, we got to deal with the subject because it's an important subject. It's part A of question 1. Number 2, there was just this, we just got done with the experience of divinity, now we got to frame it out. And therefore, part A, question 1, and it fits together here. So 1 is it's just here because it has to be dealt with, and that's where they place it. Number 2 is it fits after the experience, because after the experience, you got to frame it out and figure out what you just saw. Number 3 is Krishna just railed big on bhakti. And now Arjuna wants to understand that compared to other things he's heard about spirituality. Number 4 is within the very chapter itself, there were both impersonal and personal features, and now Arjuna has to figure out which of those 2, because he's at least intelligent enough to understand the basic incompatibility. And if you try to make them compatible, you won't succeed, because if you say there's room for variety within divinity, you just became a Vaishnava. You just became one of us. I think any of those 4 answers works quite well. And I saved yours for last because I wanted to show you there were, other possibilities. Tadeo, was that what you were going to say?
No.
I could tell from the beginning, because you went back to the 10th chapter, you started talking about this or that, so I could tell that you weren't. Do you feel that what I've said is better than what you were going to say?
Yes.
Okay. Do you feel like you understand the question now? Like what was going on? How we moved from 11 to 12?
Yes.
And, you just have to be a fool to not think that the 12th chapter is brilliant. And so these idiot academics who just are like reading a comic book or something like that, and because all of a sudden the Gita got philosophical, they think that's a bummer because they really want to be like reading a comic book or something like that. Whereas now, this is like exactly what we want to know. Like, this is it. Best question ever. What were we going to say? Loud.
I'm feeling kind of dumb, but I also, the question seemed to me kind of dumb in itself, because you're asking a person.
I understand your question. So, Arjuna is also an everyman. And therefore his questions give Krishna a platform to explain things to everybody. In the poetic language of our lineage, they say that Krishna aimed the arrow of his instruction at Arjuna and then garlanded the world. So now you have an arrow which becomes a garland. That's kind of cool, right? And then he's aiming it at one person, but he's garlanding everybody. That's kind of cool too. And so the conversation between Krishna and Arjuna is a conversation for all of us. That's always an option for you. You always have that card to play. Anytime you're looking at anything, there's value in that. Also, Arjuna just saw a personal and impersonal form. He just saw Krishna as everything. He just saw God in every atom and every atom in God. That goes against the lovely form of Krishna that he madly fell into divine illusion with so he could embrace Krishna, sit on the same bed with Krishna, and disport himself on somewhat equal terms with Krishna. And now he just opened the whole thing up. I mean, when Yashoda looked in Krishna's mouth and saw the universe, she wanted to faint. And so an experience of the opulence of the deity makes love impossible. That's why devotees shake it off. That's why it doesn't inhere in the devotees of our lineage. They can't hold it because it would disturb their intimate love for God. So Arjuna just got a massive dump of opulence. And it's enough to shake anybody, and he's asking for Krishna to clarify. He may also already know the answer and is asking Krishna so he'll instruct the world, just like a guru may sometimes ask a disciple even a question, or vice versa, even though they know the answer, just like a Kaustuba Prabhu was here, who's senior to Raghunath. But then they were sitting together, and Kaustuba was like, Raghunath, what do you think about this? And asked him a question. But clearly, he was trying to contain Raghunath and focus Raghunath on answering a question he thought might be reasonable for someone in the audience to have asked. So there's any number of ways you can work around what's wrong with Arjuna. And you've been studying the Gita with us for years and years and years now. So you're not just reading the verses of the Gita at a one through where you could read the whole Gita, 700 verses. No, an hour, less. Sometimes they say 45 minutes. Let's go with an hour or less. I don't know that you would have understood all these points had you read the Gita in an hour. And you're 20 minutes, half an hour into the conversation now. So you're half an hour into a conversation. And you were just having a nervous breakdown 5 minutes ago, and a panic attack, and an existential crisis all in one. That was like 25 minutes ago. And so the idea that you would have fleshed out everything and understood everything, I don't think so. You're thinking, well, if I'd read all the purports and studied the book for years, by the time I get to this point, all my questions have been answered. Yeah, because you're sitting with me. But the world's filled with hundreds of millions of idiots who read the Gita and get next to nothing from it. Including professors of Indian philosophy. and indulges. And like the idiot I quoted. Does that answer your question in half a dozen different ways?
Yeah, I mean, right when I raised my hand, you started to answer that question.
Okay. All right. I don't even really want to answer the question because I don't want to answer the question because we got 5 minutes left and I feel like we're warmed up, but this is the kind of subject where I'd actually like to go through the verses with you. I can do it. No, why not? I'm going to do it and then we'll start and we'll do it over again next class. Does that make sense? All right. So Krishna responds. He says, Mai avesha mana yemam. Those whose minds enter into me. Those whose minds are in me. And nitya yukta upasate. And they worship me by being always yoked to me. Shraddhaya para upetas, and endowed with transcendental faith. They worship me and stay ever connected to me. And always absorb their minds in me. So there's cognitive and behavioral features of this verse. Nitya yukta implies action that's more behavioral. And then my mano avesha mai, their minds entering into me, that conveys more a mental thing. So you can see cognitive behavioral features of this verse. And the idea of upasate, that they're worshiping me, also conveys some degree of behavior. So there's physical things you're doing and there's also mental things you're doing. Those people, and that's not it, you have to be endowed with transcendental faith. Because as Krishna has explained before, bhakti requires faith. You have to have some conviction that by connecting with this thing, there's going to be value in it. Otherwise, you might, have compassion for somebody or love for somebody. But bhakti, Krishna mentions, yo yo yam yam tanum bhakta shradaya archita michasi. If you want to worship something and be devoted to it, you have to have faith in it. He expresses the same thing actually in the 17th chapter as well. He says a person's made of their faith. What your faith is, you are. Because what you value is what you pursue. Axiology is really the study of value. It's the combination of aesthetics, what's beautiful, and ethics, what's good. Those two things get thrown under the same umbrella. It's called axiology, the study of axios, of value. And so, what you value, what you consider to be important, is what you focus on and what you move towards. And so without faith, your worship of Krishna would be fake. It'd be form over substance. It'd be fake. Ati bhakti chor lakhan, famous Bengali saying. Too much devotion, sign of a thief. Ati bhakti chor lakhan. You find people who are cheaply devoted, who are pseudo-devoted, who make a big ostentatious display of devotion, but their heart's lacking. There's trust. Trust is the fabric of any relationship, platonic, romantic, or divine. Without trust, you're condemned to a superficial relationship or a relationship of exploitation. And that exploitation can be mutual, but it's a relationship of either exploitation, it's a business relationship, or it's a superficial relationship. But intimate relationships, divine, platonic, or romantic, all require trust. It's the currency of any serious relationship. And faith is really trust in Krishna, such you devote yourself to Krishna. And so Krishna says, those whose minds are devoted to me, and those who are always linked to me, and have a transcendental faith, te me yukta tamamata. I consider them to be the most united with me. Yukta tama. They're the most yoga to me. Same language. Who's yoga vit tama? They are yukta tama. They are the most yoked to me. And so Krishna answers the question. It's the bhaktas. And confirmed. And thank you very much for joining us on IGTV. with half a minute